Hi, Evan. How are you today?
Yeah, I'm great, thanks. Ivan, how are you doing?
Very well. It's going to be very complex for me to do post production because of the same name, but it's great. It's great to have you today, and thank you for finding time to join me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me to join.
Could I ask you to introduce yourself for people who don't know you?
Yeah, of course. I'm Ivan Hurd. I'm very passionate about anti-fraud, and currently I am globally responsible for fraud and security at Quantexa, which is a British AI unicorn company. I work across different industries, so I do essentially anti-fraud work across banking, insurance, government, large corporates, telecommunications, and a whole range of different fraud problems. So it's quite a versatile role. I get to see a lot of different problems, which is really interesting. My background, though, I've worked in criminal prosecutions. I've worked in forensic investigations, forensic accounting, forensic data analytics, and audit as well. So got to see a few different things over the last while.
Well, that's great. It's a really impressive background, and we're going to touch some part of this during this podcast. But I want to start with the simple questions. Fraud prevention. What is fraud prevention for you?
So it's a great question. I could talk about a few different things there. I could talk about customer experience. I could talk about different techniques in terms of countering fraud and preventing it. But actually, one of the things that's quite interesting to me is what it feels like to work in fraud prevention. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about Greek mythology. So there was an individual called Sisyphus in Greek mythology who was a king, and he was a particularly nasty individual. He killed a lot of people, and this really angered the gods, and the gods devised a punishment for Sisyphus, and they essentially gave him this huge boulder, and they put him on a hill, and they said, "You're going to have to push this boulder up that hill." So he pushed the boulder all the way to the top, and as he gets to the top, the boulder comes crashing down to the bottom, and then he has to push it all the way up the hill again, crashing down to the bottom. And every time, forever, this is his destiny, is to push this boulder up this hill, and he never gets to the top. Now that is what it feels like to work in fraud prevention, because you have to work really hard. It never stops, and every time it gets to the bottom, that's because they've reinvented a new way to attack you. They've reinvented a new technique. And it's just a constant effort. So it feels like that working in fraud prevention. And that's what it means to me.
First of all, thank you for this analogy. It's like first time across all episodes someone like came up with the idea like of the Greek like history, and yeah, I understand what you mean. And sometimes what's the like you think of fraud prevention, you push one and it's going back to you with multiple things.
Yeah,
And you just like don't know, you need to like push the same things, or you need to start to push all of them at the same time, or you just like, I don't know, try to find a way how to just stop everything, which is like
it's
common problem I believe for everyone.
exactly. It's a bit like water. You try and stop it and it'll just flow in one direction or another. So you have to be constantly trying.
100%. And for how long are you in the fraud prevention industry?
So I've worked in the fraud domain for about 15 years in different ways. Some of that's been in detection of fraud. Some of it's been in investigation of fraud. But I'd say across those 15 years, probably about 8 years specifically in like prevention type work. So about 8 years of prevention.
And if you're looking on the industry for last 15 years, how's the industry changed so far, and where it's actually going based on your opinion?
So, in the last 15 years, I would say that fraud hasn't actually changed a huge amount in terms of the actual type of fraud that's being attempted. It hasn't even really changed in sort of since 20 years ago with sort of Bernard Madoff. It hasn't changed in, even further back to like Charles Ponzi 100 years ago, even going back to like the Roman Empire when you had a couple of soldiers defrauding an emperor, or ancient Greece where you had seafarers committing insurance fraud. Like the actual types of fraud, there's only so many ways you can defraud somebody or an organization. That actually in itself hasn't really changed. What has changed is the evolution in the infrastructure and the ways in which they can perpetrate those same types of fraud. So, in terms of the modern day fraudster, they have a complete arsenal at their disposal in terms of tools that they can use to commit different types of fraud. Whereas like 15 years ago, they might be starting to experiment with Photoshop and creation of images and adjustments to images to help facilitate committing a fraud. Maybe it was to apply for a loan and they needed to fraudulently create a document, or maybe it was an insurance claim and they needed to create a document. Nowadays, obviously with generative AI, you can create an image completely fictitious. If maybe it's a picture of, a building before and after some flood damage to commit insurance fraud, or maybe it's a fake invoice that's completely fabricated. And this has been sort of this technology jump forward with regards to some of the new innovation has been fantastic for us as a global economy. But from a fraudster's perspective, it's opened up huge opportunity with regards to how they can reinvent the same types of fraud that they always were able to do with different techniques before. But it's made it much, much easier. We look at generative AI in terms of the opportunities, but you've got things like Love GPT, which is used for romance scams to create essentially fake profiles on dating websites. You've got Fraud GPT and Worm GPT and other types of specialist capabilities and tools that are specifically designed to enable fraud to occur. So the arsenal of capability is really expanded, whether it's in the availability of a mule account to support money laundering, whether it's in the abuse of a company to be able to facilitate a fraud to occur, professional enablers. So you actually have people that make a living, not out of committing fraud, but living out of creating the infrastructure for a fraudster to be successful. So stolen credentials and credential stuffing attacks, validation of those passwords, actual like creation of companies. These are all actual sort of things that people are doing and selling on the dark web as almost like a supply chain to enable these sort of frauds to occur. So the actual sort of fraud evolution, I haven't seen, new types of fraud. I've seen new attacks in channels. So we're obviously doing a lot more online now in terms of you can apply for a credit card, or you can do a lot more through a digital channel than you used to be able to. So that's changed the type of fraud. But actually, in terms of falsehoods, misrepresentation, deception, the classic sort of way in which fraud occurred millennia ago is still happening now in terms of it just enabled in a much different way.
So we can say that like types of fraud like remain the same. However, subtypes, how we like differentiate like specific attack, it like increase because we even from like fraud prevention side, we start to looking on this one from different perspective. Before for us, everything that's related to money, it was like money related fraud. Nowadays, we have like huge segmentation, like credit card, email, etc., etc. And when we look on some cyber part, like 10 years ago, it was like cyber part. Right now, it's like malicious activity, stolen credentials, data breaches, etc., etc. So it's like the wider spectrum of terminology increase. However, like the main structure like still remain like the same.
Yeah, you're ultimately going to misrepresent the truth. You're going to deceive someone. You're going to capture some information that you probably shouldn't know. It's the same techniques, just it's evolved, and the whole terminology exactly. It's just proliferated.
Yeah. And when we're speaking about your career, like first entry point, why you actually decide in the first place to join fraud fighting area, and what's the most important, what's keep you here for a long time?
Sure. So, I mean, when I started my sort of professional career, I worked in like audits in finance. And so I was going into different businesses and looking at their finances and how things worked. When I was doing an audit of a company, I actually discovered a fraud. So I was working through their books and through their records. I was asking them questions, and I was asking them to show me some evidence of that supported the records. And I got this feeling, I just had this feeling that there was something wrong. So during that process, I started to pull at these threads, and eventually I kind of uncovered some information that kind of gave me more cause for concern, more cause for concern. So ultimately, through that work, we discovered that there was a fraud happening, and the whole process of the investigation occurred, in terms of actually digging into the records, doing interviews, and all of those different things. So as part of my discovery of that fraud, working in a related job, but I wasn't specifically looking for fraud, but I found it. Ultimately, that got me really excited. The whole process around it was fascinating. Growing up, I used to read books and watch TV shows about Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie and Poirot and all these things. But doing it for real whilst I was working on the job suddenly got me really excited. And my whole career from that point was like, let's go and do this type of work because it's really interesting. In terms of the things that have kept me involved and kept me kind of stimulated, I would say the first thing that I would highlight is you're always going to have a job. Like I just mentioned, for millennia, these types of things have been happening. It's always going to occur, and they're always going to find a new way to knock that boulder down the hill, and you have to start pushing again. The second thing I would say is that the creativity that's required in the role is actually quite high. So people think about, fraud investigations. They sometimes think of it as sort of numbers and numerical and logical. It's actually very creative because you have to constantly be thinking about the environment in which it's occurring, how somebody would be perpetrating it. What would you do if you were in the shoes of the fraudster? Or if a fraud has occurred, how did it occur? What was the root cause? Going down that kind of analysis. So you have this beautiful harmony between logic and creativity, which I find personally really challenging, really engaging, really exciting. So that's another huge factor. The final thing I'd say is that as a genre of work, you're kind of doing some societal good in what you're focused on. You are protecting vulnerable people. You are also working on things that would be justice in terms of trying to move it to a position where justice has been done. I even had a colleague once describe what we do as sort of a desk-based Batman, which is kind of cool, right? As a vigilante justice, you're not a cop, but you are involved and you are, working to the greater good of things as well. So for all of those reasons, I'm kind of motivated, inspired to continue down that pathway that I started all those years ago.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and specifically how you come into this industry. Like you mentioned, that a lot of people mention that you have this feeling that gave you perspective that something not right here, and you start to investigate. Because for a lot of people, we have two types of people who might say, it looks strange, but yeah, it's not my job. I don't need to do. I don't want to spend time here. And we have another one who just usually end up in the fraud prevention, because you look on this one, you try to understand why it's here, why it happens, what's the logical solution in your mind that's can wake up you every night until you realize how it's work. Yeah, that's a fascinating feeling. I know for me specifically, and I know a lot of people who feel the same. It's really cool.
Yeah, I certainly lost a bit of sleep on that one, trying to figure it out.
Yeah. And actually, speaking about that one, do you have any fraud nightmare case that you can shake from your memory and still annoying somewhere?
So, I mean, I do. I guess the nightmare cases that I have, probably a little bit of a different way of thinking about it. There's been a couple of occasions where my bank have blocked a transaction on my account. And there's two events in my lifetime that were pretty high impact. I went on honeymoon after we got married. We were really tired. We got out to Sri Lanka. We went to Sri Lanka on honeymoon. And when we arrived, my bank started to block all of my spend in the country. And it was a false positive, right? I was legitimately there. It wasn't a fraud, but they thought it was a fraud. And the whole issue there was that they had all this data at their disposal. They could see I'd booked flights. They could see I'd booked, a hotel in the country. They should have known I was there, but back then they sort of relied on the customer to tell them that they were going on holiday. I was getting married. I didn't have time to ring up my bank and tell them I was going on holiday. So, for me, that was a bit of a nightmare, because suddenly I was in a country and I didn't have any money at my disposal, which, is a bit of a problem. So then in the middle of the night on the phone to the call center, trying to get them to, persuade them that I legitimately am in the country and I do want to spend the money. And the same thing happened to me a couple of years ago with the same bank, where, I was trying to make a payment to pay off my insurance premium. And they blocked my transaction, and they were like, well, you've already paid your insurance. Why are you paying your insurance again? And I was like, well, you're not using your data properly, because I have different types of insurance. I have car insurance, house insurance, health insurance. Like, obviously I'm going to pay more than, like, might have to pay more than one different insurance company. That's completely fine. But also, this is a direct debit that comes out of my account every year. So from my perspective, from a customer experience perspective with MyBank, I was shocked at that they weren't able to use their data in a way that actually gave them like the context of my transaction to help them actually make a good decision about blocking or allowing that to happen. So it can have a really nasty effect on customer experience. And so when you ask about that kind of nightmare fraud cases, it's probably a slightly flip on its head answer with false positives. But for me, I was pretty shocked that they weren't able to kind of distinguish between those legitimate circumstances versus like what the actual fraud is.
Yeah, I actually remember these kind of things that previously bank asked you to choose the country where you travel to give us a flag, and every time I don't know about your bank experience, but based on my bank experience, it was somewhere where you have no idea it's supposed to be like this functionality. To find this functionality to mark a country, it was like ridiculous hard.
It's
You just like
buried in the app somewhere.
yeah, and they say, why you not like did this before you fly or something? You just, because I have no idea. So you have this functionality in place. Yeah. And
I mean, I
that's a
have some sympathy, right? We're all trying to do the right thing. We're trying to, but at the same time, like, the technology out there is much better than this now. So, it's ultimately that made me chuckle.
yeah. And from the victim perspective, have you been victim of fraud?
I have, yeah. So actually, a different circumstance, and actually a different bank at the time. I experienced a card not present fraud. So someone had taken my bank details. It must have been, I think, maybe buying a pizza or in a garage or something. They take your details down and then they sell those details off to criminals who can then defraud your account. Well, the bank in that case, they were fantastic at that point. So I was victimized, but before I'd even realized that, they had identified the transaction. They'd sent me a notification to say this has happened. We've also blocked your card. You're going to get a new one, and we've reimbursed your account as well. So, that for me, in that experience, the bank were fantastic in handling that, because they'd been proactive. They'd identified it. They'd solved it. They'd reimbursed me as a customer. I didn't have to ask or communicate with them around any of this. And they actually sort of really protected me. So, that was one fraud experience. I mean, obviously, I'm also subject to the, constant deluge of attempts that happen on a daily basis. The text messages, the fake adverts, the emails that you get, the phone calls that you get. It's non-stop, the falsehoods that come into our lives on a daily basis. I experience that all the time. I'm seeing more complex attempts at that as well, in terms of like more sophistication in the way they're doing it. But in terms of frauds, that was one where I was a victim, and I'm not afraid to say that, or ashamed of it either, because it happens to the best of us.
It's a great great example when you really experienced your bank. I don't want to say this issue like sometimes they do something that I don't understand, but I believe, of course, we all have false positive. It's pretty normal. If we don't, we probably reject most of the things.
Absolutely.
And speaking about SMS, I'm really waiting for a moment when we're going to be sunset this experience, because I'm so tired of this thousands of SMS. Every day they just send you some crap, and you just I blocked this number 2 days ago. They send it again. It's nightmare.
It is. It is. Hopefully the end is in sight with regards to control over the communications channels and things. There's a lot more they can do these days.
And you mentioned you had experience working for some government organization in the fraud fighting. I'm just quite curious how it is different compared to working, I don't know, on the merchant side or working like in the company where you're working right now. Like, what's the main difference if you can like highlight it?
So, I mean, in reality, the attempts and a lot of the sort of modus operandi are very similar. So obviously there's certain differences between like a bank payment channel versus like an insurance claim versus like a government grant scheme or something like that. But ultimately, governments they give out a lot of cash through different channels, whether it's to buy things for procurement for different functions for government to operate, or if it's to actually provide support out to the community in some way, shape, or form. A lot of cash goes out the door from different governments around the world. So they are therefore targeted at a very large scale. So for me, the primary differences, are essentially, I guess it's probably in the manifestation within the context of a specific scheme versus how you would see it in like a bank or in an insurance company. But ultimately, the same kind of underlying criminal apparatus are still at play. So infiltrating in insiders, synthetic identities or stolen identities or identity fraud in some way, and then abusive company structures as enablers for it to all occur. These are all very common like things as alongside that kind of social engineering to convince people to do their bidding. These are all things that are very common across all of those industries, and we see it repeating in the same patterns time and time again.
Oh, great. Yeah. Because for me, I'm really impressed about what the government doing with their work. All this organization related to, I know, NHS insurance, like the people doing incredible great work. They like preventing thousands of claims that's like not actually happened, or all these like fake companies who do travel money across the boards, like and everything that you mentioned. And for me, from my mind, working in government, you're really strict a lot because you're supposed to be like really like generally speaking, you have a lot of things you need to check before you start to action. That makes sense, but probably impact of one case much higher rather than impact of one rule, even in huge company. That's my
Yeah.
expectation.
No, you're right. And actually, there is a difference as well because there's a high focus in all of those industries around like the customer experience and, especially in the digital channel, the speed at which things get paid out. So there can be real differences between them in that kind of way as well.
Amazing. And I want to speak with you about one of the most popular certificate in the world, which is CFE, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Could you tell me about it? And do you think the people really need to get this one? Do you really need this one in the industry?
Sure. So, I mean, I am a certified fraud examiner at CFE. I'm qualified. And that is essentially, it's a qualification which is granted by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. They're a global body, and the exams and the sort of studying support is really focused around certain topics. So you can learn about financial transactions and the associated schemes. It teaches you about international law. It also teaches you around some of the prevention methodologies and deterrent methodologies. And it also educates you around the investigations process and the way in which that works. So from a learnings perspective, there's quite a good opportunity there to learn about a whole variety of relevant topics that can be really helpful to your career and your abilities as part of a kind of fraud fighter. So I think it's really beneficial. Do you strictly need it in order to be a fraud, work in the fraud profession? Absolutely not. There are a lot of people that work in our profession that aren't qualified as a certified fraud examiner. But is it hugely valuable in terms of the learnings? Yes. Is it recognized as a qualification by employers and others across the industry? Yes. But in addition, it also opens up opportunity for networking. There are lots of events and webinars and knowledge sharing that is sort of part of that. So I think there's a tremendous benefit from participating in that community and having that qualification, both for your career and your own abilities. But it's not something which is a sort of barrier that would stop you from working in fraud if you didn't have that.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Thank you. Because when I'm looking like in a position which right now open around the world, most of the time organization like government related or like bank related really start to require this certification, I believe, because it give you like some high level of understanding, as you mentioned, around like regulation and all this part. Like fin crime, I believe, is a huge part of it. When we're speaking about like network, you're the first one who mentioned this one. I know I had an interview with Jim, who told me like 18,000 people right now have this certification. That's like incredibly high. I
Mm.
didn't imagine it's like so many people of that. And if I'm ask like more direct questions, is it really help your career when you got this one?
Yeah, so I think it's helped in different ways. I actually found like studying for it to be quite interesting. There like I at the point in time when I actually sat my exams and did the qualification, I'd already actually working in the industry for a little bit. So there were things that I knew, but there were also quite a lot of things that I actually found interesting to learn about. So the study for the qualification helped me in terms of understanding and pointing me at things that I didn't know before. I also think that across the fraud profession, it's actually quite a good thing just to continue to educate yourself. And so this is one way of being able to do that. So I did find it beneficial from that perspective. The ongoing benefit of that, I do find that attending some of the events that I've attended and listening to some of the speakers that regularly participate in their programs, you can get some great insights around the dark web, around synthetic identities, around essentially the criminal apparatus that's enabling a lot of this to happen. So there's a big knowledge sharing component to being part of that network. So I do think there's a real benefit. I've personally benefited from it in those ways as part of my own career.
Yeah, that's what I actually want to hear, because some people get some certification, and it. I'm not meaning this one. It's
Mm,
nowadays have a lot
yeah.
of them, and it's not really help you like during the road of your fraud career. And I feel this one is really became one of the things that can shake your career really high, and you can end up in some areas where you never saw you before, I believe.
Absolutely.
A bit more, probably last question. We have two types of positions. It is IC individual contributor and like manager position. First, pretty simple questions. What is better, IC or manager position?
So I guess from my perspective, the individual contributor is quite good fun, right? So you're constantly challenged. You're really having to work hard in that space. I think regardless of whether you become a manager, you're always going to be required to be an individual contributor anyway. So you kind of have to enjoy that part of it, because that's always going to be a real component of the career and the job that you have to do. I think the benefit of then becoming a manager is you get teammates, you get other people that can actually play the game you want to play and do things that actually constructively allow you to scale the impact that you're trying to create as an individual contributor. So from that perspective, I think there's real value in becoming a manager. The one sort of learning I've had around that though is that as you take that step from an individual contributor to a manager, there is a different skill set required for you to be a good manager. And so that whereas for an individual contributor, you're studying the subject matter itself, you're studying and trying to perfect your knowledge around all of the things that we've discussed today through books, through movies, through looking at resources on the web to try and understand things. Actually, as you become a manager, there's a whole different set of books and movies and resources you need to tap into to understand coaching, to understand how you set objectives, to understand how you actually get the best out of people and motivate them, how you demonstrate leadership. Like there's a whole different set of skills that come with the responsibilities of being a manager. And the earlier that you can kind of start to tap into those, the better from the perspective of kind of your success as a manager and your ability to switch from an individual role to much more of a manager position.
Yeah, it's very clear. And do you have any common questions you ask people on interview? to understand if they are ready to be a manager in your team, or
Yeah.
they are not ready. They're good as I see.
So that's a really good question. From my perspective, the thing that I'm really interested in the interview is what makes them function, what gets them out of bed in the morning and creates that fire in the belly to make a difference with what they're trying to do. And then I'm usually interested in listening to the way in which they answer that question, which will give me a lot of insight into kind of why they want to be a manager. Why is it that they want to do that type of job? What is it about the actual subject matter that interests them? And so that can be really quite telling, in terms of that background on why are they wanting to do that. That then gives me an indication of how passionate they're going to be, what sorts of, behaviors I can expect to see from them in terms of how they're motivated and that sort of thing. So for me, that's kind of a key question. And then the other thing I would say is that naturally, as part of that, you kind of want to understand the depth of understanding and background of content that they really managed to assimilate over time. So technical questions are always a really good part of that and it's not that there's necessarily an expectation that somebody would know everything by any means, but often there are complementary sets of knowledge. Maybe someone's a real specialist around synthetic identity, or maybe someone's a more of a specialist around like accounting and finance and has special skills in that way. So being able to sort of test the depth and the breadth of their knowledge is usually quite a good sort of basis of trying to understand how they would fit in culturally, how they would fit in technically to complement.
And I believe you're also asking about a bit of like homework preparation. That's like to make sure they know what they're applying for, and they know at least some high level maybe understanding about areas where they want gonna to work. Because for example, if I'm from payment perspective going to work on account takeover, I know how account takeover works, but probably my expertise is much lower rather than in payment perspective.
Yeah, exactly. So testing in on those discrete areas is really important as well.
To be honest, I don't have any other questions. However, I always give opportunity to you. Maybe if you want to share any project you're working on, or if you want to motivate people to attend any specific events, or any piece of advice at the end, here's a great time.
Sure. I mean, in terms of the industry, I think there's some great things happening out there with regards to new technologies and the adoption of LLMs, large language models with knowledge graphs. There's some really cool data science things that you can do in that space. There's some really good things around entity resolution and network analytics that are quite exciting in terms of the opportunities to put some more context around those events and prevent the false positives and improve investigations and ultimately help protect things in a better way. So all of those things I think are quite exciting. In terms of advice, what I would say is that I think having a thirst for knowledge around the topic is something which is tremendously helpful. So if I go back to describing Sisyphus and pushing his boulder up the hill, the more that you know, the easier that boulder pushing becomes. So having that thirst to continuously learn and to tap into industry publications around where fraud losses are occurring, to tap into thought leadership from different experts in the industry, putting forward points of view about where we go next and what not alternative strategies are out there. Engaging in networking opportunities and discussions is absolutely critical to kind of furthering knowledge. But even the basic things of watching, even sort of mainstream media is now picking up a lot of the interesting areas for us. You saw Tinder Swindler, the other guys, like there's some great documentaries, some great movies about the way in which fraud manifested. So just staying current and following that and enjoying it and having that thirst is absolutely something which is really integral to success in having the outcomes and furthering careers, definitely.
Thank you for all these advices, and thank you for joining me today. It was a pleasure to speak with you, to record this amazing episode, and learning all your background and your expertise around what happens in the industry. It was really great, and I'm personally really enjoyed this one.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you, Ivan, for inviting me on this. And it's a real pleasure to speak with another Ivan. It's great.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah. And I'm going to say my favorite word, which I say on each episode, which is cut.